I want to begin, as usual, by thanking Dave Whelan and the Talbot Spy for creating this partnership with the Talbot County Free Library that gives me the opportunity to speak with terrific writers and poets. And my guest today, I got to tell you, I'm just over the moon about this, is the National Book Award winner, Alice McDermott. One of my heroes. My wife told me that this morning that you were one of her heroes as well. So I'm a little concerned I may get carried away as I speak today, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to begin by reading a little bit about her so you'll know just how amazing this woman is. Alice McDermott's eighth and most recent novel, The Ninth Hour, made it to the best books of 2017 list of, are you ready? The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and many others. Her seventh novel, Someone, was longlisted for the National Book Award. Three of her previous novels, After This, At Weddings and Wakes, and That Night, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Charming Billy won the National Book Award. That Night was also a finalist for the National Book Award and the Faulkner Award. Her stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Harper's, Commonweal, and elsewhere. She has received the Whiting Writers Award, the Corrington Award for Literary Excellence, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for American Literature. In 2013, she was inducted into the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. Last year, she retired from Johns Hopkins University, where she was, for 23 years, she'd been the Robert A. Maxey Professor of Humanities. And I'm hoping she retired so she could spend more time writing. Alice, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. That was lovely. Thank you.
If I could, if there were time, I would ask you to read entire chapters of your novels, because really each one is perfect in and of itself. People always talk about a chapter being like a little short story. These are better than little short stories. They're little breaths of life. I'm always just in awe of what you can do in a chapter. But I do want to give our audience today an idea of just how extraordinary your writing is. I'm sorry I'm doing all this build-up. But I wonder if you would read for us from The Ninth Hour, the first three paragraphs of the chapter entitled Rose.
Sure. And thank you again for the lovely introduction. I'll be impossible to live with for the rest of the day. Yeah, this is a chapter that takes place almost midway, not quite. And it's, I don't always title my chapters, but this particular novel called for it. And this is a short chapter entitled Rose. We had on our father's side a great aunt, Aunt Rose, a tiny woman, very old. We recall a velvet hat and a pale broadcloth suit, rose-colored perhaps, and maybe the smell of rose water about her as she made her way into the house, one gloved hand steadying herself on the long server that had been our grandmother's, one skimming the backs of the chairs that line the dining table, skimming our cheeks as well as she encountered us one by one. Our father behind her, carrying her bag, saying, "Step aside," telling us, say, "Good afternoon," say, "Pardon me." Our father, the doorman's son, banging her two suitcases against the chair legs and setting the porcelain in the china cabinet ringing. This was in the drafty house in Hempstead where we grew up. It was an old house, red shingled and white trim, plagued with an endless series of tumble-down catastrophes that made our father in midlife a caricature of the hapless, city-bred suburban homeowner. We recall him prowling through the rooms with a stepladder on his shoulder, with a hammer or a socket wrench in his hands, doing no good. Our mother, when she was well, always smiling indulgently, following him with her eyes. the old Hempstead house. We recall the battered glass knob of the side door, our shoulders to its peeling paint, a nest of boots and shoes inside, no matter the season, a tattered rag rug, the dark basement breath of heating oil and cinder block and cold dirt. Then 3 steps up to the narrow kitchen, dark green countertops, black linoleum floor flecked with red cabinets, appliances of enamel and steel, scent of clove and cinnamon and sunlight and dust. The narrow passage to the dining room, lace tablecloth, lace doilies, lace curtains at the window, and beyond it, a continuation of lace, the apple tree in full wind-scattered bloom, or maybe a sudden shower of snow, as old Aunt Rose steadied herself, coming into the house, one gloved hand on the long server that had been our grandmother's, one running along our cheeks.
Yes. Is that fabulous? And I got to tell you, the old Hempstead house is the house I grew up in. I'm convinced of it.
I've heard from a lot of people who grew up in that house. I'm starting to wonder.
I think you're right. It was a crowded place.
Right.
The Ninth Hour is an interesting title. What can you tell us about the title?
In the prayers of the hours, the Catholic and Christian cycle of prayers, the ninth hour would be equivalent to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which again in the Christian tradition is the time that Christ died on the cross. So it appealed to me for this story in a number of ways. But one is that it seems to me it is a fulcrum hour. In the Christian tradition, it's the moment that Christ dies on the cross. So it's the end of his life, but it's not the beginning of Christianity. Nobody knows what's going to happen next. It's 3 days before Christianity begins when he rises from the dead. So I see it as a moment within the Christian story, not just for people of faith, but just in the story, the narrative of this man's life, of a moment of complete uncertainty. And yet hope has not been extinguished. Yes, he died, but we've been told he will rise, but he hasn't risen yet.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a moment in that narrative of sort of holding one's breath, sort of the quintessential what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
When faith is still possible, but also the lack of faith is still possible. Oh
Certainly.
my gosh, he just died. He's not coming back.
Yeah.
He was as mortal as any of us. And I think a lot of the lives described in this story are in that, especially the narrators, which are sort of the younger generation described, are in that moment of, I don't know if I believe or not. I like the story. I'm I'm waiting to see what happens next, but I don't know. And so that seemed the perfect place for these characters.
Oh yeah, I agree. And as you just showed in the passage you read, so many of your stories are told from the point of view of family members remembering what they were told of their parents or their grandparents' generations. It's an interesting way to tell a tale. I'm thinking about Charming Billy, The Ninth Hour, and occasionally after this. Why do you do that?
I'm not sure. Why do I do that? I think in some ways, it's a tip of the hat to the very tradition of storytelling. For most of us, most of our storytelling takes place in our early years within families, being told about a time before you were born, when you weren't here, maybe you don't remember. So there's that, and I mean, not just to honor the tradition, but, you know, what a strange thing that we tell stories so much. You know, we have language so we can do it, and no other creature does in quite the same way. But the consistency of it. If there's one thing that we always do, you know, besides eat and procreate, we tell each other stories, or we tell ourselves stories. And it's a way of, I think, you know, sort of reaching after a kind of immortality, a kind of, it's not lost because I told the story. It's a way to stand against time, which I think much writing is, and poetry. It's a way to say, yes, it's gone, but it's not. And so I'm interested in, and I love us for that. If there's anything that I find redeeming about human beings, which sometimes gets harder and harder to do, it is that impulse to tell a story, to sit down with a stranger, and before you know it, the conversation, there's a story being told. We're creating stories about ourselves all the time.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, I love that too. And in the ninth hour, there's one of the main characters, a young woman named Sally, who, when she during her adolescence, she visits an invalid, and this woman, the invalid, has a collection of China dolls. And you write, it occurred to Sally, just out of her own girlhood, that with only the slightest act of imagination, she could bring the dolls to life. Were you a storyteller? Speaking of stories, were you a storyteller from an early age? And did you bring your dolls to life?
I suppose I did. I mean, I think my family would argue that I was more the absorber of stories.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you know, even now, my older brothers will look at me and say, how did you remember that? So I think, you know, I think being the youngest child and the only girl in a sort of Irish American, heavily patriarchal family, I was the listener. But certainly, I think the impulse to tell stories comes exactly from hearing stories, just like the impulse to write stories comes from reading stories.
Right. And I love what you said too about the things that, hearing the stories of things that happened before we were born. You know, there was something about that I remember as a child, you know, the idea that those things really happened, but I would never be able to touch them. You know?
Yes, exactly. Right,
Yeah.
right. And there's one way to say, well, you know, that's over, that's lost. That's a time that's gone. But story says no. Story says it's not over, it's not lost. And as a matter of fact, I can make it better than it really was. I can tell it to make me look good, or I can tell it with more insight because I know what happened 50 years later after that moment. So I mean, it's magical in some ways that we have this capacity, not just the impulse, but the capacity to tell each other stories.
Yeah, I agree. The stories you tell are so human, so down to earth, and yet extraordinarily compelling. I mean, I can't put your books down. But so many of us, including myself, I'll willingly admit, we often seek out books that have great car chases in them and gun battles and whatnot. Do you think we lose something when we go after wild escapades in our reading, and at the expense of what life is really like?
Oh, you know, I think literature has many varied values, and storytelling has a variety of intentions. And there are some times that you want to delve deeply, and you want a catharsis, and you want to spend some time with a writer who's asking, what is this all about, and what's our experience worth? And sometimes you just want car chases. You know, you know, there's the escape, and then there's also the sort of drilling down. And you know, I think we need it all. I don't think we should ever settle for just one kind of story or one kind of writer.
That's good. That makes me feel better, because it takes a good shoot 'em up to put me to sleep at night. I need those.
Well,
Um,
I remember saying to my editor about the ninth hour, you know, when the adjective that I often get when I publish a book is a quiet, you know, it's a quiet book. And I said, I started with a suicide and I ended up with a murder. What more do I have to do?
Good for you. You're absolutely right. Unless I give anything away,
Right, right.
I want everybody to read this book. One of the things that makes your books so incredible for me is that they're like time machines. You know, they all, most of them take place within relatively recent past. The ninth hour is early 20th century. After this is the 50s and the 60s. But you managed to hit upon little touches of information about the early 20th century in the ninth hour, and same with the 50s and the 60s and after this, that to bring that all back to me. I mean, I wasn't even alive in the early 20th century, but you make me feel as if I had been. There's a scene, there's a paragraph or two in the ninth hour where you describe the laundry convent, the convent in the convent's laundry in the basement, and you talk about all the solvents that they used, and there are all kinds of things that there's you don't mention Tide, you don't mention Cheer, there are all these things I've never heard of for cleaning purposes, for instance. Where did you learn all that? You weren't alive in the early 20th century.
Well, that particular bit of information was just a lot of fun research. I knew who my character was, and I think this is true of selecting details in general. You have to know who knows the detail first. You know, I think a lot of writers, especially young writers, who do research and then come up with gems of really interesting stuff that would be great to share at a cocktail party, but maybe doesn't belong in your novel, but they get inserted anyway because here's a neat piece of information. And
Yeah.
I've always worked from know the character first. Know the character, the situation, the background, even if none of that stuff ends up in the novel itself. But if you know the character, then you know what you need to know that the character already knows. So I had a character of a nun who's the daughter of a laundress who works in the laundry. So she knew a lot about how to clean things, especially how to clean the habits of the nuns who were nursing nuns. So I had to find out what she would know. And then that just became fun. I began, reading turn of the century guides for housewives, and they all work.
Do they?
They're
I'll
all,
remember that.
they're all good, right?
Yeah. Well, and you use them so well that people listening to this who haven't read the ninth hour may be thinking, oh, it's a book about laundry. But what Alice does with that is she talks about what Sister Illuminata is cleaning off of these nursing nuns' habits. And there's mucus and blood, and each little stain is a story in and of itself.
Right.
You really do that well. How do your stories develop? Are they products of a moment's inspiration? Do they spring fully formed from your brow, or do you write and revise and revise?
Yeah, it's more of that writing and revising and revising. I would like the fully formed to show up someday. It saved me some time. No, I mean, again, there are all kinds of writers and there are all kinds of stories. But in my case, it's more of a writing to discover the story. For me, character and language are first. And I sort of trust or hope or just hold my breath and plunge forward, that through character and through the working at language, finding that right detail, finding the detail that's not just something that would have been observable in the early part of the 20th century, but that also resonates for the characters, for the world, for the story itself. And so I'm always hoping that through the working of language, then story begins. If bring the story language is just, it's like journalism. I mean, who wants to do that? Just telling something that already happened, rather than bringing something to life that didn't happen, that only exists within the pages of the book. So it would just be, for me, just writing to convey is torturous. It's writing to discover, in kind of the same way that I am as a reader. I think many of us, we read, we don't want to always guess, oh, that's what's going to happen, and then it happens. It's that moment as a reader when you think, I would never have realized that if I hadn't read this novel. I would never have seen that in that way if I hadn't had the experience of seeing it through this character's eyes. So as a writer, I want to be my own first reader. I want to be, oh, that connects to that, and that's why she did that. That cleaning of the nun's habits is a kind of miracle that happens day after day, and she's really proud of that. I didn't know that, but I discovered it through writing, just as I hope that a reader discovers it through reading.
You've got a great scene at the very end of After This, in which a young pianist explains to someone else that that in a sense the music was already there, and it's his job to try to find it and pull it out of the air. What you're describing, I think that's always kind of the way with good story. You call it discovering it. It's as if the story's out there somewhere and we have to find it.
Yeah. Well, I think I think it's a metaphor that's been used a lot, but it makes sense. It's the block of marble. The statue is contained in it. It's up to us to discover it.
Sure.
I think that's true of experience. Yeah, it's up to the artist to reshape it, to discover what's already there.
There's one of the nuns in the Ninth Hour reminded me of a story that when my dad in World War II, my dad's first day in boot camp, that night, they had all the men. They turned off all the lights and had them strip down their rifles and put them back together in the dark to make sure that they really knew how to do it. And my dad, just like me, was a good old boy from Kentucky, never been out of Kentucky. And the guy next to him punched him in the ribs and said, "Pastor Earl, Mac." And Dad said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Pastor Earl." And Dad said, "I'm really sorry. I don't know what that word means." And he said, "Durl, Pastor Earl, Durl, like a toilet paper." and when I read about Sister Jean, I thought, she was there. Can you tell us a little bit about Sister Jean? She's a great character.
Yeah, she sort of connects to that whole "you write to discover." Initially I did not think after that the Ninth Hour was going to be a book about nuns, and Sister Saint Savior, who's the first to show up. I sort of rolled my eyes at myself and said, "Oh God, you're trying to shake this whole Catholic novelist thing, and here you got a nun showing up in the first chapter." So I thought, well, I can just kill her off by the end of the chapter and then I'll be free of the nuns. But nuns tend to travel in packs. They live in So but by the time I got to the end of the chapter where I could get rid of her, she had already invited 2 more nuns in. And one of them was sort of a nun that I felt I understood as a type, the take charge, Sister Lucy, serious, take charge,
sure. Yeah.
Get it done. I had those nuns in classrooms growing up. But Sister Jean showed up, and she was sort of the apprentice nun with Sister Lucy, the good old girl, of the
Sure.
convent. And I didn't understand her. As soon as she showed up within the story, I thought, she has pure faith, and I don't understand pure faith.
Yeah.
I don't get. She's young. She has given her life to become a nursing nun, to go into the poorest of the poor neighborhoods, which is what these nursing orders did at that time. the poorest of the poor, you know, cleaning and taking care of kids who, you know, were full of lice, and not in a classroom, not in, you know, any elegant sort of 20th, you know, MGM kind of Ingrid Bergman as a nun way, but doing really the, you know, the basic. Why would such a young woman choose to do that? What's her faith like? And I realized I have to write about her to begin to even imagine what her faith is like. So she was the real cipher for me at the beginning, and it really did become a matter of there's got to be some logic, you know, even if it's her own logic, she must have some logic, something that she tells herself why she did this. You know, if she was going into the convent to escape, you know, marriage to a horrible man or a father who beat her up, she didn't have to become a nursing nun.
Sure.
So it was really, again, that was I'm going to have to write to discover who she is.
And you did. I think she's fully fleshed, great lady, and she's got a terrific idea of God's fairness. I love that about her.
Yeah, yeah. She just recognizes as something essential to all human beings. We understand justice. We understand when something isn't fair. And her logic, and she's only good at articulating it to kids, you know, because it's, you know, she's very young, at least in the beginning of the book, she's young. And it is kind of, in some ways it's simplistic, and in other ways it's very basic. Why is it that we understand what justice is? Why is it that we object when something is, even children know when something's not fair? And you know, she sees it as that's something innate in us. And for her, that means that's something that God put in us. And God wouldn't put it in us if then he was going to give the ultimate unfairness. And that is let people who suffered just die and say, tough luck, you had a bad life.
Yeah.
That's not fair. It's not fair when children die in childbirth. It's not fair when human beings suffer and there's no recompense. So she sees it as, you know, kind of, it's obvious. I don't see why the rest of you guys don't understand this. Yeah. You know, God is fair. We wouldn't know what fairness is if God hadn't put it in us, and that means he's fair. So that means there's an afterlife.
And one of the things I love about her is just as you said, she flies in the face of MGM's concept of what a nun's supposed to be like. She says she speaks with this great Brooklyn accent, Earl, and make a good part. I mean, I can't do it, but I love her accent.
Right, and every other sentence is see.
Yes, see, that's right.
Cagney. You know?
She talks like a gangster. To move on from the ninth birthday after this, but before we leave the ninth hour, I want to say one more thing about it. It's my privilege to serve on the selections committee for a particular honor, literary honor that happens every year. And I have nominated your books on several occasions, and they always become finalists, but they've never won the honor. You've won lots of honors. You probably wouldn't even care about this one, but it's always, I've always wondered about that, and I'm suspicious that it may be that some members of the committee may think your books are just religious books, and and what do you say to people who just dismiss you out of hand as nothing more than a Catholic writer?
Well, my older brothers would go, she's a Catholic writer.
Okay.
Boy, the Catholics must be really hurting if that's the best they can do. I mean, you know, as you know, having been on a committee, literary awards, like so many awards, you know, if you hang your hopes on any of them, you're in the wrong place. I seem to end up on many finalist lists, you know, which is fine, which is great. There is that sense that it's an honor to be nominated. It's also better to win. There's no question. I've been a finalist more than I've won, so I know it's always more fun. In the aftermath, people say, oh, congratulations, you've made the list. And then when you don't win, they say, oh, I'm sorry. You know. But it's, there are so many. I don't think there are many awards committees that look at their list of finalists and go, we don't have any Catholics on it this time. We better put a Catholic. I don't think I'm a demographic that anybody feels compelled to appeal to. So it's delightful to me when I'm always surprised when I end up on any of those short or long lists.
Well, and I would just say to anyone who does dismiss you in that way that, boy, your novels, there are Catholic characters in them and there are Catholic themes, but there are universal themes, and I can't imagine anyone from Zimbabwe or Mongolia or anywhere else not being moved by your stories. So now let's move on to one of my all-time favorite books after this. And I wonder if, once again, to give the people watching this an idea of the book itself, if you would read the last two paragraphs on page 37 of that edition that I've been reading.
Okay. Let's see. Down the path through the dunes, she could see the pale expanse of beach and then the place where it gave way to sky. She leaned forward a little toward it, resting the bulk of the baby on the edge of her thighs. It was possible that the sky was darker out there to the east. It was possible that they would catch some part of the southern storm. She had an image of her unborn child, its head up under her heart, its ear pressed to the wall of her flesh, treading water with the flutter of its small legs, listening. It would hear the echo of the waves, the whistle of the wind, the rise and fall of its father's breath as his lips opened and touch closed. Mary Keane was more than certain, she would have said, that this was her last pregnancy. These, the last weeks she would live with the toss and tumble of a child in her belly, with the unseen future a real presence inside her. The unseen future, actual flesh and blood inside her, not as it was for the rest of the population and would be for her again once this child was born, merely imagination or hope or plan. The man Jacob would become, and Michael, the woman commiserating with her mother while the men were turned away, who would be Annie. What was moving under her hands, pressing and turning under the taut skin, was the future itself, already formed, pressing an ear to the wall of her flesh.
Wow. I've never been pregnant. But I felt as if I felt as if I had been. That's a great passage. And one of the things I love about your books, I keep saying that, is this is not easy to do either. You have married couples that are real married couples. I mean, they fight, they hold grudges against each other for years on end, and yet it's clear that they love each other deeply. It's not easy to create good characters, it's easier to create wicked people, but you do good characters really well, and your married couples are so believable. And Mary and John Keane, we've just met Mary in that passage, are a perfect example of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the two of them?
Yeah, well, again, I think it goes back to that sense of letting the characters guide your hand as you're composing a novel rather than the other way around. Mm-hmm. And I think some novels get into trouble when it's the author sort of as the puppet master, moving the mouths of characters to say things that the author wants to say. So with John and Mary Keane, this is sort of a post-war couple, more of my parents, your parents' generation, the World War II generation. And there's all kinds of easy cliches about The Greatest Generation, and we know, we've all heard it and we've seen it. But I think it's the obligation of fiction to say, okay, we all know that. That's fine. That's the broad stroke. Went off to war. The men went off to war. The women stayed home. They came home. They built the suburbs. They raised their children. We know this about them. They had all these prejudices. They, they were unenlightened about sex and all the others. Yeah, that's fine. But I think fiction always says, okay, that's fine. I accept that. But what about these two? There's always even within the stereotype, even within everything that's accepted understanding of a certain human being from a certain time and place, there's always, yeah, but this particular person was a little bit different, or this particular person fit all those things, but if you knew him, he was better than that, or more than that, or more complex than that. Of course, we are all more complex than our time and our place and our generation. And I think it's the fiction writer's duty to say, okay, yeah, but what about this one? So this one couple, these two particular people with their backgrounds, how they were raised, how they came to life, how they saw things. And if you individualize it, and again, make sure you're not using them to make a statement, but rather trust that if you can see them and hear them and look into their hearts and hear what's going on in their minds, with no other incentive other than to say, who are you? They become individualized. And I think that's what happened for me with John and Mary Keane. It was like, yeah, I know. I was very conscious. This is a novel that's going to start right after World War II and move up to Vietnam. That's sort of, and I was writing it sort of during the Iraq War. That the sort of the pattern of one generation after the other facing their time and place. But there are also two people who are unlike any other human beings who ever lived.
Sure. And
we'll never see them again. They'll never, that individuality of their, and that's what I was sort of trying to pursue. So yeah, sometimes they were, they fit the cliche, and other times they didn't. Sometimes they loved each other and sometimes they didn't.
Yeah.
And it was just, it's my obligation, I think, for my readers' sake, not to manipulate them.
Yeah, and you didn't, boy. They're very real. In many ways, I think, and the title would indicate this, after this, one of its major themes certainly is time itself. What we lose to the past and what we hope for from the future. And in a way, Mary and John Keane have their own different attitudes, it seemed to me, as I was reading the book, toward time. And it tells us a little bit about them, the way they think about time. Can you talk about that some?
Yeah, I guess maybe that passage that I just read, that Mary is again, as the mother, the one, she's holding the future as a physical thing. She imagines her unborn child, not just as, oh God, I'm not going to get any sleep after the born. But more, the future is real. The future is a physical reality that I'm holding within me. I think her husband, on the other hand, again, of that generation, he's a little bit more backward looking. He has had, his experience in the war, just like your dad, the source of his storytelling is that experience that he's had, that he will never have again, that disrupted his life, that he never expected. But that's that world war that sent him to places he never thought he would go, that introduced him to people he never thought he would meet, that allowed him to observe things that he never thought he would see. That's the fulcrum for his life. Mary, on the other hand, her children and that looking forward. But they both exist in time together. which again, I think is, yeah, we look back, but we also look forward, and we try to balance the two as we go day to day. This is very much about daily life. Having said all that, yeah.
Yeah. You know, in one of the reviews I read of you, someone referred to you as America's Virginia Woolf. And I really agree. I mean, Virginia Woolf is also one of my favorite writers of all time. And and After This reminds me a little bit of To the Lighthouse, in that just everyday life. Here it goes, and it's remarkable in its ordinariness.
Yes, yeah, and also, I mean, Virginia Woolf is also, one of my formative, I think, writers. Probably the first time, having been an English major at a certain time and place when everybody I read and studied was a white male.
Sure.
And then reading Virginia Woolf, and not only a woman can do this, but wow, this is To the Lighthouse is a novel unlike anything I had ever read before, and the great freedom of language and storytelling, yes, was essential to me. So thank you. That's lovely comparison.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Another character that is someone I'll never forget in After This is Mary's friend / acquaintance, Pauline, who is this sad, unhappy, passive-aggressive woman who inserts herself into every situation and makes everyone around her wish she wasn't there. What's remarkable about her is it's the same thing you've been talking about. You make her believable. And not only believable, but you can even kind of sympathize with her. There are a few chapters in the book where we see everything from Pauline's point of view, and you come to kind of understand why the world sort of disappoints Pauline. I think it doesn't quite measure up to her expectations. How do you manage to, well, you've already been explaining that. I don't want to keep making you talk about character, but for what it's worth, I think what you did with Pauline is just out of this world. How did you do that?
Well, I mean, I think there's an echo of Pauline in Mrs. Costello in After.
Yes.
In
Ninth
the
Hour.
Ninth Hour, yeah. And it is that Mary tries to be good. Mary Keane tries to be good, just as Sister Jean and even Sally in the Ninth Hour, that have this idea that they would like to be good. Yeah. And it's easy to dismiss a character like that. It seems to indicate, well, you're not a very complex person. If that's all you want to be, good. You have half a brain, you can be good. And I think that attempt to be goodness has to come up against the reality of how awful we are. I mean, it's really hard to be good around, all the annoying, to say the least, habits of those of us who are human. So in some ways, Pauline was that Mrs. Costello for Mary's attempt to be good. And Mary even lectures her children, it's easy to love one another when it's just your friends, the people you like. It's hard when it's someone like Pauline who's not lovable. And that's where you have to make the extra effort. And that's where you have to accept the burden of their unhappiness and don't expect gratitude. What happens with Pauline, not to give too much away, but in some ways, Mary's persistence to allow her to stay in the life of the Keane family when they all would love to get rid of her, is that as time progresses, Pauline has an opportunity, almost unbeknownst to herself, to offer solace. Even the solace she offers is her neediness.
Yeah.
But Pauline becomes especially needy to them at a time when they are facing the worst moment of their life. And so in some ways she brings a solace that no one could have anticipated. Maybe it's a reward for sticking with her for so many years when she was just driving everybody crazy.
Oh, that's terrific. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I hadn't thought about some of you're still teaching me. And that leads nicely to my next question. After this, as the title implies, there is a major event. I've just reread After This for the umpteenth time, and I think there are a number of after this is actually in the book.
Yes.
But there's one big one, okay, that is pretty traumatic for the Keane family. And it also happens to be dramatic. And most writers would jump at the chance to liven up their story with the description of that big dramatic event, but you don't. The whole thing takes place, if you will, off camera, and instead we hear about it. Reflect upon what happened throughout the remainder of the book, and you do in other books. Why do you do that, and how do you pull it off so well?
People looking for the car crash might think the camera had gone to the dramatic event rather than the aftermath of the dramatic event. But again, with this novel, it was very much a novel about dailiness, and these tragedies, such as the one described, arrive at the doorstep of families in the midst of their daily lives. That there's not a warning bell that's sounded and stop everything you're doing and hold your breath and turn up the lights and then this event will happen. I mean, in some ways it makes the tragedy, I think, even more keen, in that in the midst of ordinariness, these things strike. And they strike families, and they might strike the family next door, and meanwhile, you know, you're cooking chili. You know, there's the wonderful W.H. Auden poem, you know, the Musée des Beaux-Arts, you know, that this is how tragedies happen. The Icarus falls from the sky while someone else is just walking dully along. You know, it's in some ways what makes it so poignant to me, that most tragedies happen not in the grand Greek tragedy sort of way, but while someone else is just walking dully along. And so it seemed to me that because of the logic of the novel until this event, it's about dailiness. It's about how we get through. So it would have been, I think, sort of a real upsetting the logic of the story to have run off to the jungle and had machine gun fire and bombs exploding. But it's in the routine of our daily lives. Death happens, tragedy happens, beautiful things happen, you know, love comes, goodness comes. We get solace from the characters we least expect to get solace from. Yeah. It's all of a piece.
One thing, we're running short on time, and I do want to put one in here that I've just got to mention. There's a great scene in After This where at one point in the novel, John Keane and his two sons finish off their basement, and they put in paneling, and they close off the bathroom and hang a door, and they do this using a do-it-yourself manual that they purchased. And one of the hardest tasks is hanging the door. I've hung a door before; it's not easy to do. And then later in the novel, you have John Keane walking through his parish's new church that they've just built, and it's his first time seeing it. And he walks along, and he passes one of the confessionals, and he opens the door and he checks to see if it's hung properly. How do you know that about us guys? That's exactly what we guys do. I once laid a tile floor, and I can't walk over a tile floor without checking to make sure everything's proper. Right. How do you know that?
I guess it's hanging out with men all my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it's, you know, that was John. You know, you get to a point, I think, in composing a novel where you do know your characters, or at least you've discovered them well enough, that you almost don't have to think about it. You know, it's not, I think Faulkner said, all you're doing is running behind, taking down notes. It's not quite that simple, you know. But there is that sense of, oh yeah, he would do that, of course, because it's not, because I know him now. You know, I know enough about his life from the things that I've written that stay in the novel, and from the things that I've written that I've taken out of the novel. I know him well enough that you begin to trust the characters. Again, it's the logic. From the first sentence, you're building the logic of a character. You're discovering it yourself, and then you're fine-tuning it, so that after a certain point, it's, yes, he would do that. There are plenty of other men in that world who would not have done that, but John would.
Sure.
Right?
Do you ever fear that your characters will get away from you, that they'll do something that you hadn't planned on their doing, and now where do I go with the plot?
I mean, that happens. Yeah.
Sure.
And again, it's that trusting, you know, if you're hanging on, and this is one of the hardest things to teach young novelists. You know, I always tell them they hang on to their first ideas about their story, or their outline, or the notes, you know, like kids hanging on to the side of the pool. You know, it's never going to learn to swim if you don't let go of the side of the pool. And so it's that, you know, when you thought this character was going to do this, say this, and end up here, and then through the writing, the kind of incantation, which is the working at words, the character does something else. And then it's your obligation as the writer to say, is that true and authentic? And if it is, then I have to give up control and see where it takes me. But you can also say, no, that's not true and authentic. That just happened to my brother and I just ended up putting in there, but it has nothing to do with what I'm writing. So it's not that every you know, wrong turn leads to the right place. Sometimes it's just a wrong turn.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I wasn't kidding when I told you, I'll never be able to thank you enough for all you've done in my life. Okay, you know, your writing really touches me and touches my wife. It touches I make everybody I know read your books.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I will continue to do that. You take care of yourself, okay?
You too.
You're a good person.
We'll get through this. I hope we talk again.
I like that. If you ever get to the Eastern Shore, please give me a call. I'd love to take you out to dinner, okay?
Wonderful. Right. In the next world when we go out to dinner again. Right?
That's right. That's right. Well, we can do that again.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you all. Well, thank you, Dave.
Take care.